Meantime, let's go live to the Prime Minister's Parliamentary Secretary, Alan Tudge. As I say, Mr Tudge, we're standing by to go to Bill Shorten, but in the meantime, I want to ask you about a few issues quickly. The Greek Parliament, it's approved, voted in favour of the third bailout after the referendum and all the negotiations. Finally, that vote taken, despite, as Jim Middleton reports this morning, the violence outside the Parliament, that vote taken, and as Alexis Tsipras had hoped.
G'day, Kieran. Yes, I've just heard that news as well, and I think that's an encouraging sign, and hopefully that will lead to some greater stability in Greece and across Europe, and that Greece can now provide a platform for greater economic growth and get themselves out of these difficulties that they've had.
Oh, now let's look at the domestic issues that have dominated the last day or so, in fact the last few years really, in politics, and that is the carbon tax, carbon price debate. Your reaction to the events of the last few days, have we made too much of a discussion paper which basically just confirms in broad terms what Labor has said for some years now, and that is that they will take a carbon price to the next election?
Yeah, well, I think there's two things that have come out of the last couple of days, Kieran. Firstly, it is absolutely, we know for sure now that the Labor Party intends to take a carbon tax to the next election. And what that means is higher electricity prices again for Australian residents and greater pressure on our struggling manufacturers. That's the first thing which we've learnt. But the second thing, which is equally as damaging, and that is that there's obviously pressures within the Labor Party to destroy Bill Shorten's opposition leadership. Now, this was done for one intent only, this leak, and that was to put maximum pressure on Bill Shorten. He's already under pressure because of the Union Royal Commission. He's under pressure because he's not performing in the polls. He's under pressure because he's still committed to the appalling boat policy. And now there's people who are trying to destroy him with this leak.
So you don't see any difference between an emissions trading scheme and a fixed carbon tax?
At the end of the day, Kieran, whether it's a floating price or whether it's a fixed price, it is still a tax on emissions. That's what it is. And bearing in mind, I refer back to the last carbon tax that Labor introduced. And yes, it started as a fixed price, but then it moved to a floating price. And that floating price was forecast to go all the way up to $350 per tonne by 2050. And that presumably is what Labor has again installed for us, should they be re-elected.
Now, in terms of the government's approach, though, direct action is paid through taxpayer dollars. You'd accept that there's still a price to be paid. It's not free.
No, but it's not, Kieran, it's not a slug on electricity. It's not a slug on everyday residents, on everyday businesses. What it is a fund which, through a market mechanism, purchases abatement at the lowest price. And we've done that very efficiently already. Something like 50 million tonnes of abatement have been purchased through the first auction alone. And it means that we can reach our 2020 targets without having to put pressure on electricity prices, without having to make our manufacturers less competitive versus manufacturers from around the world. That's why our policy is working so well. Well, let's just take one step at a time.
But obviously the debate's now about post-2020 heading into the Paris talks. How do you upscale it? How do you do that?
Well, Kieran, just let's take one step at a time. We met our first Kyoto target without a carbon tax. We're meeting our second Kyoto target without a carbon tax. We'll meet our 2020 target without a carbon tax through our direct action policy, and we'll continue to be able to meet whatever target that we set post-2020 without having a carbon tax.
Okay, now let's wrap up, if we can, on this issue of negative gearing. The RBA warning about the negative gearing vis-a-vis the capital gains tax treatment of investment properties, and that maybe this is fueling too much investor activity in the housing market. What's your take on it?
Listen, we don't support changes to negative gearing. There's an important principle at place here, and that is that if you make an expense on an investment, you should be able to tax deduct that expense. And that's a principle across all walks of life in Australia. But secondly, should you reduce negative gearing, it will put greater pressure on rental prices. Now, that occurred in 1985 when the Hawke government tried to scrap negative gearing, and they subsequently had to reintroduce it. Now, that's our two major concerns. Now, if we want to address housing affordability, then really we've got to address it on the supply side of the equation. And that means releasing more land, which state governments are now starting to do, and they should be able to do more on that. And it means that having more houses being constructed, and fortunately we've got record housing approvals at the moment. So we've got to address that supply side if we're really fair income about addressing housing affordability issues.
Alan Tudge, appreciate your time this morning. Thanks for that.
Thanks so much, Kieran.